Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and wherever you are, good afternoon, good morning if you're in America or in Europe. And welcome to this very special unveiling of this new book on cinema by Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee, which has been published from Cambridge Scholars Publishing UK, Newcastle upon Tyne. Uh, this book is titled, very interestingly, The Fluid Frame in Cinema, Collected Essays. The boundaries of our vision in life, as in cinema, only dawns upon us much later, like the fade in and fade out of stars at dawn or dusk. Conscious knowledge of when a glance has become a gaze and a scrutiny a survey makes for the frame, that lowest common denominator of our vision at any given moment. This lowest unit of seeing in cinema has had a checkered history. From a distinct recounting of narrative with its self-contained devices and meso-scenes to the fluid frame where the spectator is not allowed any space or time to form a field of vision. The overflowing visual signifiers, no longer shackled to the frame, can now form new associations with each other and the whole. Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee's essays in the fluid frame in cinema inhabit, as she points out in her preface, this very fluid frame of critical inquiry. We are now privileged to have amongst us Professor Chinmoy Guho, who is also the guest of honor for this special occasion. Thank you so much, Chinmoy, for joining us today, this evening, despite the fact that you are quite unwell. Thank you so much from all of us and everyone who is listening to this program. Without further ado, I would go on to introduce our very special guest of honor today. Chinmoy is a noted author, academician, essayist, and critic. He is Professor of English, University of Calcutta, and former Vice Chancellor, Rabindra Bharati University. He has 3 titles of knighthood from the government of France. The first one awarded in 2013, Chevalier de Lettres, the Art des Lettres, Government of France. The second, the Chevalier de Palme Académique, was awarded in 2010. And the most recent one, Chevalier l'Ordre National du Mérite, 2019. He is the proud recipient also of the Lila Roy State Award for Translation from the Paschim Bongo Bangla Academy in 2008, the Bidyasagar Puruskar, again from the Paschim Bongo Bangla Academy, this time in May 2017, and he is also the recipient of the Sahitya Academy Award of 2019 for his book of essays, Ghumer Dorja Thele. There are several, countless seminal publications to his name, but the one that I have to mention, I think, is Where the Dreams Cross. It's a wonderful book on T.S. Eliot, which has been lauded in such august places as the Times Literary Supplement and the Times Higher Education Supplement. So without further ado, we shall now request the author, Pradipta Mukherjee, and our guest of honor, Professor Chinmoy Guho, to go forward for the formal unveiling of the book for all of us. Sir, if you might, Pradipta, if you will, we can move to the unveiling of the book. Akash, could you please bring the book up close on the screen, a close-up shot of the book cover, please? It's a fantastically designed cover with very evocative scenes on it, on that piece of celluloid. Thank you, Akash. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Congratulations. Congratulations, Pradipta.
Thank you, Shondeep.
Many
Thanks to
congratulations,
all my
Pradipta. Many
panelists
congratulations.
for supporting the event. Thank you, SRFTI. Thank you, Ashokda, for being with us here today.
Yes, sir. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir. Without further ado, Chinmoyda, may I request you to say a few words on this occasion?
Yeah, so dear friends and colleagues, I'm really very happy to launch The Fluid Frame in Cinema, a collection of essays by Pradipta Mukherjee. Well, I have known her for a very, very long time as a PhD supervisor, when she worked very diligently on Shakespeare adaptation on the celluloid. Films were not easy to come by in those days, but she showed a remarkable strength of mind and singleness of purpose, which was exemplary, to speak the truth. She has always remained very focused on the subject, which is not often the case with academics. We hop around from one subject to another, leading to sometimes inconsistencies and I would say lack of depth. But in her case, I was very much impressed by this single-mindedness. And I'm sure many of you will try to get the book. If you look at the contents, there are 3-part divisions and about more than 20 chapters. This shows a desperate attempt to understand cinema. What else can one do? One tries to understand literature. Literary criticism cannot do better than that. So same thing with cinema. One can only try to understand the power-packed 7th art. Let's not forget that if it took English literature 7 centuries from Chaucer to reach James Joyce, cinema travels the same space in less than 40 years and reached a level of écriture that can match the new novels of Alain Robbe-Grillet or Marguerite Duras, or perhaps even magic realism. Perhaps not to that extent, but it did. So the journey from Griffith to, say, Tarkovsky is remarkable, and one can only wonder at the tremendous power of this medium, which has presented great masters like Bergman, who can match any philosopher of our time, the 20th century. I don't know why they are not compared with the masters of international philosophy, sometimes thinkers, because the intensity is no less, certainly no less. And if there are a Nobel Prize for cinema, unfortunately there isn't any. I'm sure Satyajit would have been one of the first 4 winners of the prize, because they opened many windows in the 1950s, for example, which even literature did not, to that extent, the great masters. So I really enjoyed having a look at Pradipta's book. She has always tried to go under the skin. That's what we should do. Let's be more than a chronicler, or talk about banal things about the contribution of cinema to entertainment and education and history. But can it really extend our area of consciousness? That's very, very important in my mind, to my mind. Can criticism take us to the mystery of human consciousness, which cinema tried to evoke? in the last century, and this one. So I think Pradipta has always tried to do her work in a very, very sincere way. I wish her all the best. And remember, if the book helps change our art of seeing, the art of seeing, to quote Aldous Huxley, only then a book of criticism becomes meaningful. So I'm sure Pradipta's book will do that. Thank you very much, and wish her all the best. And I thank everyone present here, including my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Chinmoy. Thank you so much. These words mean a lot to us.
Thank you very much. Despite your, you are not very well this evening, but thank you for joining us and saying such kind words and being with us here today. I'm really grateful to you. My heartfelt gratitude to you, sir, for being the wonderful supervisor that you have been during my PhD years. I can only remain indebted to you for everything. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradipta. Thank you, Professor Guha. It was a really inspiring, but in a small talk, you've raised a lot of talking points already, which going forward, we hope to use and we hope to talk a little bit about amongst us panelists. Thank you so much for being here with us, being unwell, blessing us with your presence, your gracious presence, and your very interesting words. Thank you, sir. Now, I would hand it to Pradipta to, I think, well, I mean, we can take it up straight away with the panel, shall we not, Pradipta?
Devashish, I think before we start the panel discussion, may I introduce you to our viewers this evening? I would
Yes,
like
of
to
course,
introduce
formalities
you
have to
to
be
our
maintained,
viewers.
yes. But
Yeah,
please
but
be very brief
I
about it. I am a very simple person. Please be very brief about it.
I just wanted to let you all know that I think I do not have a very strong Wi-Fi connection at home this evening. So in case I'm not audible, please let me know.
No, you
Am I
are perfectly
audible to all
audible
of
right
you?
now. Yeah,
Okay.
perfectly.
Okay. So the anchor of this evening, my very good friend Debashish Lahiri, is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Lal Baba College, which is affiliated to the University of Calcutta. Debashish's writings on post-colonial theory, Indian, American, African, and Australian poetry, European modernism have been published in international journals and anthologies of criticism. Debashish, as we all know, is an internationally acclaimed poet. His 4 books of poetry are First Will and Testament, published by Writers Workshop. The second one being No Waiting Like Departure, published by Authors Press. And No Waiting Like Departure was shortlisted as one of the 5 best collections of that year by Scroll and India Today. His third book of poems, Tinder Tender, Poems of Love and Loitering, published by Authors Press. And the fourth one being Poppies in the Post and Other Poems, published by Authors Press, which Julie Dee just mentioned this evening about Poppies in the Post and Other Poems. Passage sans verbs. If I translate this to English, the title would be Landscape Without Verbs, is a French translation of his selected poetry, which was published in May 2021 from Editions Epic from Algeria. And to my knowledge, that makes him the first South Asian poet to be published from Algeria. His final collection, which is coming up, is Legion of Lost Letters. This is a collection of narrative poems on common lives in Roman Britain. And this is due for publication in 2022 from Black Spring Press, UK. And my friend Debashish is the recipient of the Prix du Merit Naji Naman Literary Prize for Poetry in 2019. So welcome once again to the show, Debashish. And with this, I hand over the session.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pradipta. It's an August panel that we have here, and at the very outset, we are very sorry that we are missing Mr. Raju Raman, who was supposed to be here with us, but who has contracted COVID and has gone into isolation. These are the little tolls that the time takes upon us, but we wish him the very best, and we hope to get him back on this platform at some later time, because cinema happens to be also one of his great passions. So the format that we have is a very simple one. We will have initial comments from all our panelists, 5 to 7 minutes. And once we finish the first round of comments, we will take it from there and mix it with the author and perhaps also later bring in the audience. So I would go in this particular order. I will first go to Dr. Julie Mehta. Dr. Julie, I'm going to introduce her formally. Dr. Julie Mehta is a specialist in post-colonial and world literatures. She's a PhD in English and South Asian Studies from the University of Toronto, where she conceptualized and taught cultural studies and diasporic Asian poetry, fiction, film, and drama. Her current research focuses on representations of women, foodways, and Asian North American identity. Julie Mehta holds the Mary H. Beatty and Dr. David Chew's fellowships at the University of Toronto. She is the author of Dance of Life, Mythology, History and Politics of Cambodian Culture Post-Genocide. She is also co-author, along with her husband, Dr. Harish Mehta, of the best-selling biography of Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen. Her translation of Rabindranath Tagore's Dagkhor, performed in Toronto, won her the one of 16 most influential South Asians in Canada recognition. Julie, the floor is yours to hold forth on the fluid frame in cinema.
This is such a wonderful moment. I've known Pradipta and Debashish for a while with my husband Harish since we came back to look after my mother, and they are really the luminaries of the next generation. I'm very proud and very privileged to be here. So thank you for having me. Ambitious in reach and scope, Pradipta's book, The Fluid Frame, is an exploration that seems dangerously extensive at first encounter. Sweeping geographies and histories, blurring spatial and temporal paradigms, racing from ruminations on Indian cinema to the crossroads of adaptation from King Lear, to the French Lieutenant's Woman, Wuthering Heights, The Great Gatsby, and then straddling Hitchcock and Kubrick through romance and horror. Author Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee might leave the reader breathless at first. But as the reader tippy-toes into the acknowledgements and introduction, she is slowly but firmly charmed by the clarity and unpretentious statements of intent and conceptualization of this project. I do suspect in most other scholars' hands, a project of this magnitude might become dangerously unpegged, and if I might say, even unfocused. But it is to Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee's credit that she does not allow any loose moorings, overwhelming theoretical interpolations or critical opinions to cloud her explications, but expertly anchors her analysis and constructions and deconstructions in accessible language, keeps her gaze focused on each film she approaches with erudition, balance, and a banquet of diverse insights. She captures the magic of the moment, and as Professor Guho just said, is able to go under the skin. As a threshold, there is a lived experience she shares with her readers that is somewhat unusual in an academic volume. And here's why. Her informal style, where she celebrates and acknowledges her mother-in-law, the late Ila Mukherjee, endears her to the reader at once. And it is this slightly unusual approach in her writing that she brings to the more challenging content of global cinema studies, a strong currency of both veracity and easy connect. Revealing with clarity the impulse that made her write the essay, she says, and I quote, "They chart my progress from being fascinated by the medium to striving to make sense of that fascination. The collection may thus be best described as reflections, explorations, and meditations on cinema. In the writing of this book, which has lasted for over a decade, 12 years, I think she told me, she says, I tried to begin by recording my impressions of motion pictures, a sequence of individual pictures. But I experience it quite differently, as a steady stream of sensations. The desire to write a book on cinema, the most collaborative art forms, came with the realization that films are a highly complex act of communication. This is what is celebratory in this mega project of Pradipta's. It is at once accessible in its application. She follows meticulously her own understanding about how a medium like cinema is effectively communicated. And she says, and I quote, films are a highly complex art of communication, and in turn demands of herself an inquiry into the uneasy relationship between art and entertainment. One of Pradipta's greatest qualifiers as an effective academic is her lucid thinking, uncluttered articulation. This work has the potential to benefit scores of young scholars who pursue film studies. The author's arrangement of her swath of research and analysis into well-allocated areas and very organized chapters makes this collection stand out amongst much of the literature in the field. In part one, and since I'm opening this discussion, I think it would not be wrong of me to describe that in part one, Ruminations on Indian Cinema, Pradipta covers some significant material. Ritik Ghatak's partition-sparked films, representations of gender by postmodern millennial filmmakers, Devdas, reflections of masculinity a la the Rathors in Jane Tu Ya Jane Na, Maqbool with a refreshing eye, often turning theorists of cinema studies such as Laura Mulvey and her male gaze on their head, as in the case of invoking the female gaze. In part two, she effectively reawakens the idea of cinema at the crossroads of adaptation. Possibly the hottest theoretical candy on adaptations, my senior colleague and professor mentor at the University of Toronto, Linda Hutchin, would find Pradipta's essay on the adaptations of Lear, King Lear, by Kosinstev, Kurosawa, Brooke, and others, as well as appropriating the French lieutenant's woman on a screen worthy of applause. In this section, also noteworthy are the interrogations of The Great Gatsby and adaptations of Wuthering Heights. In part three, rigorous in her interrogations and vigorous in her careful unveilings, Pradipta invokes Hitchcock and Rubric to unlock the troubled mind, as she says. I particularly love this part of the text, since Birds, Vertigo, Rebecca, and The Shining are seminal texts that have recently been the stuff of resurrection, from romance to horror to psychoanalytical theorizing. Julia Kristeva and Sigmund Freud find themselves to be VIPs to this party once again. If there is one major missing window here and a gift that does not fit my wish list, Pradipta, it must be that Deepa Mehta's Water, Earth, and Fire are missing in the diasporic women directors in part one. would have also liked to see Meera Nair's Monsoon Wedding explored in this otherwise remarkable, wonderful collection in the fluid frame. As I mentioned, I've had the pleasure and the privilege of knowing Pradipta as a fellow academic and a friend for the time that Harish and I have been back here in Kolkata from Toronto for over 7 years. And it gives Harish and me great delight to celebrate this significant accomplishment with Pradipta Debashish, my Srijan colleagues and friends, Dr. Ashok Vishwanathan, and all our panelists. Congratulations, Godspeed, and good luck to Pradipta for this remarkable cache of treasures on cinema. I turn to Roland Barthes and leave you with the thought of the author leaving her work, once done and dusted, to the cradle of the reader. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the excitement that you've shown with regard to the fluid frame, the enthusiasm with which you've perused the essays, and the comments that you've made on the breadth of the scholarship. One quick kind of, you might say, a rejoinder to what you were saying. You said that you missed Meera Nair and Deepa Mehta in the panoply of directors who are, analyzed and looked at. But I think she has the essay on globalization and Hindi cinema, where there is a mention to the diasporic directors, and also in the essay on the women directors in Indian cinema. There are both references, although she has not been. And as you said, we look forward to the second installment. More of this, please. We have our appetite has been whetted, and we are waiting for the second installment of another book of essays, perhaps in the near future, if not too late. So, and maybe she is mulling over, actually looking at these directors in that second volume, I think. So thank you so much, Julie, for your initial comments. We now move on to our next panelist, Ashok Vishwanathan, who is a multiple national and international award-winning filmmaker, and who is currently Professor and Dean at Satyajit Ray Film and Television Institute, Kolkata. He has directed more than 150 films, including feature films like Shunno Theke Shuru and Kichu Songlap, Kichu Prolap. He has been Charles Wallace Scholar at Downing College, Cambridge, and has won the Pishari, PFJA, Kalakar, and Jaycees Awards, besides the Silver Torchlight Award at the Pyongyang Film Festival in 1994. He has been chairman of the jury of the National Film Awards on 2 occasions, and on the International Netback jury at Kolkata International Film Festival 2014. He has been visiting professor at Tufts University, Boston, and Monmouth University, New Jersey. Vishwanathan is an active theatre worker, and with performances and drama direction in more than 40 plays, including I.S. Johar's Bhutto. Vishwanathan has also acted in nearly 30 films, including television and television and OTT productions in English, Bangla, Malayalam, and Hindi. He is currently the president of Poetry Paradigm, the leading society of poets in Eastern India. Ashok, if you might take over now.
Thank you very much, Debashish, for that kind introduction. And many thanks to Pradipta for giving me this opportunity to address this August gathering, meeting somewhat prematurely in January, and also to Professor Chinmoy Guha for his esteemed presence. I call him Sir Cubed Guha because he's been knighted thrice, something unprecedented. But on a more serious note, I'd like to congratulate Dr. Julie Mehta too for opening the discussion in a very appropriate manner. She has described, in essence, the contents of the book, The Fluid Frame in Cinema, and in some detail. her appraisal, her analysis, her critique allows us to venture into one or two of the areas which one could take off from. So although I would be referring to one or two of the topics in the book, I'll make my own take on it, because after all, you have the book to read from, and it is an interesting book, as she said. And one of the things she said touched me, because it's a book which is understandable. Some of the critical writings on cinema are often unintelligible, as Mrinal Sen was fond of saying, you know. There's so much of jargon going around that one forgets the cinema which is lying at the core of it all. One misses the wood for the trees, but that's not the case in Pradipta's book. And that is not to say that it lacks analysis. There is a lot of analysis too. There is probing, and there's a lot of allusion and reference. So I'll talk about adaptation initially in my first presentation. I'd like to talk about The French Lieutenant's Woman, because I had the opportunity when I was in Cambridge to interact with John Fowles, the author of The French Lieutenant's Woman. And one of the lectures that he gave us at Downing College consisted of the problems of adapting The French Lieutenant's Woman. And I think Pradipta also talks about that. Now, the problem was that The French Lieutenant's Woman is a Victorian novel, and at the same time, it is a novel about Victorian novels. So it is at once a fiction and a metafiction. So that is one of the difficulties. The second is, how do you adapt it for cinema? You could easily do the Victorian novel bit, you know, talk about the relationship between Smithson and Sarah Woodruff, and it can be a straight narrative, but that would not be doing justice to the novel. You need the meta-narrative, you know, just as Tagore, in many of his short stories, moves out from the main text and goes into a discursive mode. Similarly, John Fowles, in what has rightly been called one of the first postmodern novels, along with his megas, you know, has actually created a whole new genre. You could use voiceover, but that would be too literary, you know. I think the director of the film, Karel Reiss, and the scriptwriter Harold Pinter, the Nobel laureate, who had not then received the Nobel Prize, but his adaptation of other films had been awarded at the Cannes Film Festival. You know, The Go-Between by Joseph Losey, and the Quintet, you know, the Trout Quintet. These films had been awarded, and he'd also written the adaptation of Marcel Proust's famous novel, you know, and that was filmed by Volker Schlondorfer. So the final solution they came upon was, if this is a novel about novels, why not make it a film within a film? So actually, The French Lieutenant's Woman contains two narratives. The one, the main narrative, the Victorian novel, the love of Smithson for Sarah Woodruff, and all that is associated with it, the milieu, the zeitgeist and all that. And the other, the relationship between the two actors playing the roles of Sarah, in this case Meryl Streep, and her name is Anna in the film. And
Mike and Anna. Mike and Anna, yes.
Sorry?
Mike and
I
Anna.
think there's a noise. There's a noise. Can something be done? I mean, there's a peculiar noise which is coming after every syllable that I utter. I'm reminded of My Fair Lady, Henry Higgins says, condemned by every syllable he utters or she utters. But anyway, now it's gone. So the relationship between the Meryl Streep character and the Jeremy Irons character, both, of course, are either married or have partners. So there is the difficulty of having a double romance. What Pinter does effectively, and Faust told me the final solution was actually thought of by Carol Rice, the director, and of course, Pinter agreed to that, and Fowles thought that to be the best. And in fact, Fowles is one novelist who has many stories made into films. And this particular adaptation is his favorite because it ends with two endings. The one which is tragic because the two lovers, and they do come close to each other. It happens as a filmmaker, I know that when you're acting with someone for a long time, over a long period of time, a relationship can develop, and it does develop. But then suddenly Anna disappears at the end, and although the Jeremy Irons character looks for her, but she's gone. Whereas in the other, they literally vanish into the sunset, rowing the little boat, in the waters. So I thought that was very beautifully portrayed. And Pinter, who is actually known initially as an absurdist, he's one of those who followed Samuel Beckett's Theatre of the Absurd, a coinage by Martin Esslin. And later, of course, he also in social sensitivity and sensibility. Came from Hackney, which is a kind of working class suburb in England. So, and in the later years, during the time that he received the Nobel Prize, Pinter became a very vocal critic of the government, particularly of Prime Minister Blair. Such a man as Pinter, in a sense, subsumes his own personality into the intricacies of this text, which was replete with several postmodern elements, not the least of them being gender and a touch of magic realism. In fact, if you look at the first shot of the film, it's the filming is going on and it's very cold and it's kind of a pier, right at the riverside or the seaside maybe, and there's a howling wind and you see Meryl Streep in all her glory walking down. That is a beautiful representation of the novel. Another adaptation which Pradipta's book contains is, of course, King Lear, and there's also Hamlet. To me, the best adaptation of Shakespeare's Hamlet is obviously the one done by Kozinitsev. Kozinitsev, who also did the adaptation of King Lear, and the dialogue, surprisingly, the subtitles were written by the redoubtable Boris Pasternak. So the Russian Hamlet is eminently Russian in its tone, and that is what makes it so attractive. It's the milieu. And of course, the principal character was played by the great actor Innokenty Smoktunovsky. In fact, in Bengal, our famous actor, the great actor of all time, Uttam Kumar, reputedly saw this film several times. And he is reputed to say that this was an unparalleled performance. Certainly so. And Innokenty Smoktunovsky has been one of the great actors on the Russian stage and on the screen, having played as Tchaikovsky in Yudkevich's Tchaikovsky. But the film works as an adaptation because it doesn't try to meticulously follow the text, but rather seeks to create visual equivalence, metonymic equivalence to metaphoric design in Shakespeare. If you look at the scene of the ghost, it's so beautifully portrayed in the film with the horses bolting, a kind of foreboding that animals have, a kind of heightened sensitivity that they seem to have more than human beings. We know that the sense of smell and the sense of hearing in animals is much more than in humans. And that has been so beautifully, albeit somewhat in a macabre manner, shown by Kuznetsov. And here too, Shakespeare has been interpreted. I mention Shakespeare all the more because Pradipta's earlier book has to do with filmic adaptations of Shakespeare. And I think Kuznetsov's adaptation is extremely pertinent, relevant, and telling. And the fact that she has this description in the book makes the book all the more worthwhile. I'll just by ending with a slight regret, just as Dr. Mehta found one or two things that she would have liked to have read. I'd say that I do feel somewhat immodestly, perhaps, that my own Shunno Theke Shuru, or Return to Zero, was the first of the postmodern texts to actually create some kind of a ripple in Indian cinema. And it would have been nice to get Pradipta's take on that film. But maybe that'll happen in a future book. So much for now. Thank you very much.
Sure, Ashokda. I'll write about that film. Thank you very much, Ashokda. And thank you so much for speaking extensively on John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman. It was wonderful listening to your critical assessment of the novel and the film adaptation, particularly the screenplay being by Harold Pinter and the direction by Carol Reyes, and the translation of the novel from to fiction to metafiction, the transition that you explained, the fiction being translated into metafiction in on screen, the film within the film that you mentioned. Yes, thank you very much, Ashokda, for your perspectives on John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman and the film adaptation by Carol Reyes and the screenplay by Harold Pinter. I'm sure Siddhartha would like to take up later on, because he has also worked extensively on the plays of Harold Pinter. So we will be hearing more from Siddhartha, I'm sure, as far as The French Lieutenant's Woman and Harold Pinter's screenplay is concerned. Thank you very much, Ashokda, for your very kind words. Thank you so much. Devashish, unmute. You have to unmute, Devashish.
Right. Thank you so much, Ashokda. What I was saying is that you've again raised a whole host of issues which we will be coming back. We will have not just a second coming, but maybe even a third. So we will come. We will be coming back. We promise that to ourselves, definitely. Thank you so much, Ashokda. Now we move on.
Devashish,
Yes.
can I just intervene for one moment? Because
Yes, please.
Ashokda was discussing the first scene of The French Lieutenant's Woman. He discussed it in detail. I have just sent the link to our Akash and Anitesh. So can we see it? It's just a 3 minutes
Absolutely.
clip. Because
Absolutely.
whatever
Why
Ashokda
not?
has said, yes, please. So Akash,
While
can
we are on the
we
case,
see
of course.
the last clip that we have, that I have sent you just now, the one which I have just posted you, that clip. Yes. Yes.
Shall we return? The wind is getting very strong.
I should have thought you might welcome a reason to hold my hand without impropriety.
Very well. Good Lord. What on earth is she doing?
Oh, it's poor tragedy.
Tragedy?
Bushmen have a grosser name for her.
What?
They call her the French Lieutenant's.
Do they?
Please come.
I must speak to her. She could fall.
She won't thank you. She's mad.
It's dangerous. Will you stay there?
Charles! Charles!
Madam! Madam! and forgive me. I'm alarmed for your safety. Come back! Man up!
Yes, I think that was the scene Ashokda was talking about elaborately when he was discussing the French lieutenant's woman. So I thought we might as well see it on screen. So
Absolutely. Thank you, Pradipta. Thank you so much. We now move to the next speaker, the next panelist who is with us today. Is Professor Shandip Mondal, who is Associate Professor at the Department of English, University of Calcutta. He has interests in the pedagogy and the practice of theatre. Along with teaching canonical literature, he has also worked in the discipline of film studies. He has completed his research work on the film adaptations of Shakespeare. His publications and interest also veer towards culture studies. Professor Mondal, you might take over now.
Thank you, Devashishta, for a nice introduction, which perhaps I do not deserve. Anyway, first of all, let me tell you, Pradipta, that I have enjoyed this book. I have enjoyed reading this book. And the last week of December, I just devoted last week of December for reading this book. I would rather appreciate this book from a purely academic perspective. In this millennium, when due to the mandates of UGC, different universities were devising, reshaping the curriculum, the syllabus, with the introduction of a semester system, CBCS system. There is some kind of paradigm shifting. We moved on to a more interdisciplinary, intertextual, multidisciplinary approach, which has more or less settled by now in Indian academics. And the book you have written is a manifestation of that change. 20 years back, people were not very comfortable with the idea of introducing a film text in the syllabus. But we also have revised the syllabus. We also have, it's not just revising, we have introduced a new system. If you go through the syllabus of different universities, film is an important component of the curriculum, not just of English studies, but of the entire humanities. It's through film. What do we actually do? We actually comment on the social milieus. We comment on history. We comment on the relation between text and history, the famous dictum, the historicity of the text and the textuality of the history. So it is in this textuality, it is in this historicity that we have always tried to place films. Your book is, a marker of that change. Primarily, it would seem that only the second part, where you have talked about the adaptations, squarely falls in this category of the interface of film and literature. But we should not restrict ourselves when we talk about this interface of film and literature only to this discourse of adaptation. This is one mistake that we often do when it comes to addressing the interface of film and literature. we boil it down to adaptations only. But the dialogue between film and literature is something beyond that. The discussion of film that talks about the culture. So the first part where you have talked about the partition, globalization, masculinity, are also expressions of that change, of that liberty that we have lately started taking even inside the classroom. And I mean, it was a pleasure reading the language. And I would like to use one phrase from a film critic who wrote primarily on Shakespeare films, is Anthony Gunaratne, a Sri Lankan scholar. He used a phrase called referential layerings. So what I found in your book is not just references, I would say referential layerings. There are different, you have crafted several layers, from one layer to another layer of several references, which comments on, which takes us back to the history of not just Indian cinema, the history of India, the politics, the turmoils of Indian history. I mean, even before partition, that is pretty praiseworthy. The third part of the book, Hitchcock and Kubrick, they are, I mean, you see, it's very difficult to make the distinction between literary texts and non-literary texts. So they are all, be it a Ray film, be it a Stanley Kubrick film, be it a play by Shakespeare, they're all cultural texts. So you have tried to address all these texts from this perspective. And I mean, especially Devashishta and Pradipta, I'm sure you're familiar with the new syllabus of our university. There are different courses, there are different programs included in this new syllabus. Students often stumble where to get books, because yes, we have introduced new texts, new films in syllabus, but books are not available. Your book would really be helpful for the students opting for new courses. Your book would really be helpful for our students in the university department, students in colleges. So I mean, that's the I'm trying to approach this from a practical and academic point of view. So I should congratulate you once more for, and this book is very readable, as Professor Mehta had described, that Ashokda has described. It's very readable, and somewhere I feel your language has some kind of a poetic effusion. Once you start reading a sentence, you cannot stop. You have to read, you have to complete the book. This is enterprising for the scholars, for the critics, and primarily for the students. So if the students can start reading an essay, and if they feel they cannot stop before completing it, it's a bliss for them. It's a bliss for us. So, I mean, you have simply opened up a new horizon, I would say, for us. Thank you, Pradipta.
Thank you,
Thank
Shondeep.
you.
Thank you, Shondeep. I really miss our interactions when I used to be a guest faculty at the Department of English, University of Calcutta. Remember, whenever we used to get a break in between classes, Shondeep, me and you, we used to discuss films. Even during
Yes,
exam
yes.
invigilation duties, when we used to get a break of 5 or 10 minutes, we used to take up one film and
You
start
asked me to
discussing
watch.
those films.
You asked me to watch Belatar's The Turin Horse, and then I watched that film.
Yes. So I really miss those days, Shandeep. We don't get to meet each other, and we don't get to discuss films these days. But hopefully, we will meet again in some academic platform, and we will keep the discussion alive. And thank you so much for your warm words and your great insights on my book. Thank you, Shandeep.
Thank you, much appreciated. In addition to this being a very serious platform where we are discussing the unveiling of a new book, we're discussing issues related to literature and cinema. I'm astounded by the fact that many of these academic cultural gatherings is also, in so many words, a reunion in disguise. Just as we have seen on show, it's the same between me and Siddhartha, because we were, university buddies all these years ago. So again, these events, although we have to maintain certain decorum, certain protocols, but we are actually almost, on the verge of breaking out, and as just Pradipta said, reminiscing once again, talking about cinema as she remember, in breaks between classes and all that sort of thing. And the time that we used to have on College Street and Coffee House and all the other, little, cubby holes and hidey holes that we had, where we had the time of our lives, and let's put it this way. So I'm actually looking forward. I have looked at these occasions as now as throwing up, and we actually have, Rajuda is not with us, but we had Chinmoyda, we have Julidi, we have Ashokda, again another little Srijan get together. So how many 3 get-togethers? We were talking about a film within a film, a novel within a novel. We have occasion within an occasion over here. So it's long may this tradition continue. Yes, Julidi wants to say something.
I just want to have your indulgence to say how delighted I am to meet Professor Shandeep Mondal on this platform, because having taught texts which are all been adaptations now in film, I was thrilled to come here from the University of Toronto and see that CU has also included new literatures and Canadian literature, which I'm teaching at Loreto now. And I wanted to congratulate Professor Mondal that he has brought forth the idea of this palimpsest, what is Linda Hutchins' very famous words, texturing. So without taking more time on that, Professor Mondal, we will have an exchange after.
Sure. We would be delighted to. And I must tell you that when we were devising the syllabus, I was voicing for one film. Siddhartha is here. He was voicing for another film. And these 2 films are Sholay from my behalf, yes, and Saptapadi from Siddhartha's behalf. So yes, we have introduced Sholay and Saptapadi.
Wonderful.
So this is something that
but I'm even talking about the literature, like English Patient by Michael Ondaatje, or Margaret Atwood.
Yes.
Those are all such handy tools, because there are many of my students here today listening to you and listening to us who will be thrilled to know that, you have done this with the concept of this palimpsest and layering. Anyway, we talk later. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Julidi. Thank you, Shandeep. Actually, as I was telling you all, this is actually seeding time. The 2 hours, the 1.5 hours that we have here on show is actually seeding time for so many other things, intellectual ideas, germination of ideas, and long may it continue. I thank Shandeep for bringing up the efficacy, the issue of efficacy and the effectiveness of a text like this, the absolute timeliness of a text like this from Pradipta. There is, of course, the ivory tower issue of it being a great text in terms of the ideas and the sheer intellectual depth of the book. But also, if we do not percolate down to the level of students who are being initiated into film studies or a study of the interface between literature and cinema by books like Pradipta's, then the purpose would be quite defeated, I think. So thank you, Shandeep, for outlining that fact and also talking about the poetic effusion, if I am to quote you, in the sentences that Pradipta writes, the compelling nature of those sentences. I am just reminded of offhand of a line from William Hazlitt, where he says that why should not we write sentences that are as long as we want to? Because the things that we want to last so short in life. So this is one chance, he says, as a writer, to make your sentence as long as you possibly can. So, the duration of the sentence is almost your life. That's where you live. So why not live it best, that sentence? So thank you so much for
May I just
also
intervene?
talking about that.
May I just
Yes.
intervene? In Orhan Pamuk's Istanbul, there is one single sentence which runs 1.5 page long. That's a marvelous sentence. Extremely poetic sentence.
And Salman Rushdie is well known for that, right?
Yeah.
So you see, Hazlitt had to face this charge so far back. He had written a sentence which was half a page long, and some critic pointed it out and said that this is too much, this cannot happen. And this was his rejoinder, that why cannot I write a sentence as long as I want it to? Because things in life that I want to last so short. So why can't I at least write a long sentence? So, but not just write a long sentence, but make it interesting as well. I think it has done both. So we now move on to our next panelist, who is, again, as I said just a few seconds before, is my university buddy, but I have to introduce him formally. Professor Siddhartha Biswas has been teaching for more than 20 years and is currently Associate Professor at the Department of English, Calcutta University. His two recent books are Theatre, Theory and Performance from Cambridge Scholars, and an edited volume, Looking for Home, Journey and Boundary in Postmodern Texts. His areas of interest include pop culture, modern theatre, and translation studies. Siddhartha, sorry.
Thank you, Debashish. Thank you for that introduction. First of all, let me begin by once again thanking you for thinking of me, for including me in this particular panel. It's such a fascinating place to be with fascinating people. And to share a panel with Professor Guho is also something, with Mr. Vishwanathan and of course Dr. Mehta. It's quite something. I wish Mr. Rajuraman could be here, and I hope he will recover very soon. So, and when Mr. Vishwanathan was speaking about the French Lieutenant's Woman, as Pradipta mentioned, it did take me back to my PhD days, because Harold Pinter's screenplay of that text was the thing that created the entire theoretical premise that I presented in my dissertation, in my PhD dissertation. And it was the beginning, looking at that film, thinking of Harold Pinter's screenplay. And I'm not really going to talk about that, because Pradipta, once again, Pradipta has a book on the French Lieutenant's Woman. And it's a fascinating book, and just as wonderful as this one. And whoever is teaching French Lieutenant's Woman has to go back to that book, because our students also do. And when I think about the French Lieutenant's Woman, I always remember one scene, the two endings that are shown at the end of the film. One is, as Mr. Vishwanathan described, the two lovers are rowing away. In the Victorian era, they have this happy ending. In the modern era, they do not have that happy ending. Anna is driving away. Mike runs to the window, looks out, he calls out, he says Sarah. He does not say Anna. And this is where Pinter brings in these two timelines together, which was absolutely amazing. The way he could telescope the two narratives with just the use of one single word. That was fascinating. And Pradipta, in her discussions, have brought out all these elements and repeatedly. And I don't know whether I have had occasion to speak to Pradipta about the French Lieutenant's Woman, but Maqbul is something that we have talked about quite often. In fact, now that we are teaching Maqbul in the classroom, I go back to those discussions and I remember her writings, her ideas, and it's very good that we have that now. Now we can present that to our students. In fact, it would be, I mean, you would be fascinated to know that Maqbul is now being taught across disciplines. We have included it not in our course syllabus, but in the general elective syllabus. So people from the departments like psychology, history, Bengali, they are all coming in and they are studying these texts with us. And we, Shondeep and I and the others who are teaching in these classes, we are thoroughly enjoying these classes because, all right, a pro-English, pro-lit kind of a thing happens all the time, but you get to have a different approach. And cinema can bring us together. And this is the brilliance of cinema. And what I have found fascinating about Pradipta's book, one, of course, something that we are all celebrating is her expressions, her way of writing, which is so reader friendly, which will allow the reader, in fact, it's not actually simple. It seems simple. She tackles all these theoretical ideas so lucidly, so easily that the reader will not even understand when he or she or they have been brought in contact with something as complicated as audio theory. So that is quite an achievement on her part. And the other thing that I found absolutely fascinating is the variety that she has managed to bring into not only the three sections. I am not really talking about the three sections, but the cross-cultural variety. The variety within the cultural divisions that inhabit every culture. She is not limiting herself to pop culture or highbrow culture, but she is bringing them together as it should be. Cinema has this journey of traversing from the popular to a medium that we now take seriously. It has not been quite an easy journey for cinema. And she has managed to bring that. And what she has done is something that we are facing even now. There is this popular perception that pop culture and highbrow culture should be enemies. Someone who believes in pop culture cannot like or cannot appreciate, should not revere higher culture. And that is absolutely, well, if you ask me, that is quite wrong, because all cultures inhabit the same political space, and we have to look at all these cultures to see the shades that are there. And she has wonderfully brought that about in that book, and that is truly one of the major achievements of this book. And I would be happy, and I would not only be happy, I would be recommending this book to all my students and all my friends. In fact, anybody who is interested in cinema can take a look at it, can learn so much from it, can be introduced to so many new ideas. Because for me, a book is the opening of a dialogue. It's not the verdict or the end. And that is exactly what she has done with her book. So congratulations, Pradipta, on this absolutely brilliant, amazing feat. And I am very happy that I could be a part of the beginning of this journey. Thank you for calling me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you for being with us here this evening.
Of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. You have actually again highlighted the sheer lucidity of Pradipta's language. It has been commended before, as far as I know, it has been commended before. Her earlier books and her conference presentations, I've been lucky to hear one or two, where she has been lauded, of course, for the depth of her presentation and the new ideas and horizons she's trying to open for us, but also the way in which she's approached. Because the opaque nature of critical language, or the way in which half-baked critical language can lead to opacity, is one of the principal major spin-off problems of post-structuralism. I mean, for all the benefits of post-structuralism, one of the great downers has been this propagation of this a very artificial style of writing, where the real content, the real vision can never shine through. So it has never been the case with Pradipta. She has not sacrificed one bit in terms of the critical content and analysis, the very incisive analysis that she has instituted. But she has managed to bypass this reliance on a certain sex jargon, which she has, I mean, she has used the jargon that we all speak, that anybody who is interested in matters cultural or has a sensitive soul can actually respond to very easily. Therefore, Shondeep could find poetry, bits of poetry in her language, which is simply because of this unmooring, this unshackling of language from a post-structuralist, might say, prison house, if I could put it that way. So, in addition to that, of course, what came out in Siddhartha's comments, of course, is the variety, which I think is to also do, if I understand it correctly, with the evolution of Pradipta as a film scholar, as a lover of films, as someone who has been watching films. It's also a signal, a signpost. All the essays are signposts of her gradual evolution as a film critic. So I think some of the variety that we look at, I mean, Julie also commented on this fact at the very outset, that how can such variety, how can such almost disproportionate amounts of interest, I mean, it's something from Kubrick to Hrithik Ghotto, from M.S. Satyu to Alfred Hitchcock, straddling Shakespeare cinema, and how could this be happening? It is happening because it's a journey. And without further ado, I would now want the author, Pradipta Mukherjee, to enlarge upon this very journey, the journey that has been the fluid frame in cinema. Pradipta, please enlighten us, regale us, and tell us more about what went behind the scenes in the smithy of the critic's heart, of the writer's heart, of the writer's evolution, as you came to write fluid frame.
Debashish, am I audible? Am I audible to all of you? Am I audible to all of you? Yes. Debashish, you have given me a rather difficult job. You are asking me to recount my journey with the fluid frame. Now, this is something really, really difficult, but I'll try and do it for all of you. This book, The Fluid Frame in Cinema, Collected Essays, was written over a period of more than 15 years, I would say. Initially, I thought 12 years, but later I realized that I have actually traveled more than 15 years with the fluid frame. And the journey of the fluid frame starts way back in 2007, when I registered for my PhD in the University of Calcutta under the able guidance of Professor Chinmoy Guha. And as I have told you before, that my PhD was on Shakespeare on screen, and the excellent guidance I received from Professor Chinmoy Guha, that is something I really hold very dear to my heart even today. And I can only express my gratitude, my thanks for the warm-hearted guidance I received from Chinmoy Guha during those very formative years of starting from 2007. And I can only remain indebted to Professor Chinmoy Guha. Now, out of that PhD dissertation at the University of Calcutta, my sole authored book, Shakespeare on the Celluloid, was published in 2014 with Avenel Press in Kolkata. But in Fluid Frame, I have written 2 separate chapters on Shakespeare appropriations, and the Shakespeare appropriations that Ashokda was discussing this evening. Okay, he was talking about the Shakespeare adaptations I have discussed in my book, Fluid Frame. Now, these 2 chapters happen to be 2 completely new chapters, and They are not part of my second book, that is Shakespeare on the Celluloid. They are not part of my second book, Shakespeare on the Celluloid, this book. And for these two new chapters on Shakespeare on screen in the fluid frame, I was motivated to write these chapters by Professor Douglas Lanier from the University of New Hampshire and Professor Mark Thornton Burnett from Queen's University, Belfast. Now, both Professor Douglas Lanier and Mark Thornton Burnett happen to be very well-known Shakespeare film scholars. And they motivated me. And after reading my book, Shakespeare on the Celluloid, they wanted me to, build a project, to frame a project on Shakespearean cinema, which I did with a minor research project with funding from the University Grants Commission. And therefore, you have these two fresh chapters in the fluid frame on Shakespeare cinema, which is also a product of the minor research project that I carried out with the University Grants Commission. Now, my connection with Professor Douglas Lanier happens to be a very old one. It may be traced back to 2008, I would say, at the Adaptation Studies International Conference of De Montfort University, UK, and University of Amsterdam. And I met Professor Douglas Lanier at Amsterdam for the international conference. Now, in 2008, by that time, I had registered myself as a PhD scholar in the University of Calcutta. And since then, Professor Chinmoy Guho, Professor Douglas Lanier, they have motivated me to work on adaptation studies, not just Shakespeare cinema, but they have motivated me, inspired me to work on adaptation studies. And years of research at the British Council Library, Kolkata, Seagull Art and Media Resource Center, in Kolkata, Pune Film Institute, Pune Film and Television Institute during my minor research project days. Life memberships of Shakespeare Society of India, Shakespeare Society of Eastern India, with their conferences, with their workshops all over India. They have helped me a lot to grow as an academician. Then way back in 2003, I was writing my MPhil dissertation under Professor Jhonna Shanal again in the University of Calcutta, when I was writing my MPhil dissertation and Professor Jhonna Shanal was guiding me on John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman. Wonderful guidance again from Professor Jhonna Shanal. And there is a chapter here on the adaptation angle, as Ashok has discussed quite elaborately. And then Siddhartha also took up John Fowles's The French Lieutenant's Woman as a metafictional detour. This is not something on Fowles that I'm writing for the first time, as Shondeep and Siddhartha mentioned. I do have a sole authored book on John Fowles, but this chapter is a fresh one written exclusively for Fluid Frame. Now, Professor Jhonna Shanal inspired me to work on Fowles during those years. And when I was doing my MPhil at Calcutta University, I remember our coordinator, Professor Krishna Sen. I remember most of my teachers, not just Professor Krishna Sen, but Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta, who used to teach us Wuthering Heights. And I have written one article on Wuthering Heights, the film adaptations of Wuthering Heights in the Fluid Frame, one by William Wyler and the other by Louis Buñuel. So Krishna Di, Sanjukta Di, Professor Amitabh Rai, who was the Shakespeare professor of English from Rabindra Bharati University, who used to come and deliver lectures at Calcutta University. And of course, the late Professor Dipendu Chakraborty, the late Professor Shubhabrata Bhattacharya, who introduced me to the world of cinema during my formative undergraduate years. Now, after 2008 at the University of Amsterdam, by the time we come to 2010, I was invited by Romance Writers of America to the conference of the International Association for the Study of Popular Romance. This was held at Brussels, Belgium, where I was invited to speak on Devdas adaptations in Hindi cinema. And the paper that I have today in Fluid Frame, the Devdas paper, and of course the other paper, Jaane Tu Ya Jaane Na, they have been immensely enriched by the perspectives of Professor Eric Murphy Selinger of DePaul University, Chicago, who is not just a popular romance scholar from the US, but also a Hindi film enthusiast. Yes, Professor Eric Murphy Selinger. And my friend Jamal Akhtar, whom I lost to COVID in 2020. He was of my age and I lost him to COVID from Seagull Art and Media Resource Center. He helped me immensely to get the necessary books and DVDs for my research during those years. I also fondly remember my colleague, Professor Pulokesh Roy, the late Professor Pulokesh Roy from the Department of History of my own college, Vidyasagar College for Women, who had given his valuable inputs as a historian. He was a brilliant scholar, a great gentleman, and he gave his inputs on my Devdas paper, Devdas adaptations. And then this Devdas paper was presented at Indian Council for Social Science Research at the Shillong campus. And I had a very senior professor, Professor Sanjoy Mukhopadhyay, as my fellow panelist. We all know Sanjoy Da from a former professor of the Department of Film Studies, Jadavpur University. And I had Sanjoy Da as my fellow panelist at the ICSSR conference in Shillong. And since then, I have always been in touch with Sanjoy Da. He has inspired me, immensely motivated me to work on cinema studies, film studies. Then the chapter on media constructions of women's sexuality in cinema. This was for this paper I was invited to present at Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. And thereafter, interacting with film scholars of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, professors who came from CSSS Kolkata, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi University. Ravi Vasudevan was there for that conference. And when I was presenting my Devdas paper at the IIA's Shimla conference, Ravi Vasudevan was sitting right there. And I have, cited Ravi Vasudevan in my Devdas paper. And he was listening to me, what I actually had to say about Ravi Vasudevan. So, Ravi Vasudevan was there when I was presenting this paper on Devdas, and I had his suggestions on my paper. So the one which you have in Fluid Frame is the one where I also have what Ravi Vasudevan had to say about my paper. Then there were project fellows of IIA's Shimla. Their perspectives enriched my paper. Then in the next IIA's conference, they were celebrating next year the 100 years of Indian cinema, where I was invited to present this paper on women directors of Indian cinema. Those were the IIA's conferences from where I learned a lot, because IIA's Shimla conferences are always a learning experience. It's a great place for research, for higher studies. And a different version of Madhur Bhandarkar's film was presented at the University of London in 2013, where I presented this paper at the Film and Media Conference. And this paper was titled Women, Media and Resistance in Contemporary Indian Cinema. And it was also published, this paper on Madhur Bhandarkar was published in the London Film and Media Reader 3, published from UK, edited by Professor Philip Drummond. So the one that you have in Fluid Frame in this book is a far more expanded version of that paper. And in 2017, the Ritik Ghatak and MS Satyu, the Partition Cinema chapter, was presented at the University of Paris 13 in Sorbonne. And Indian Cinema and Globalization paper, that was presented again at the University of Paris 13 in 2018. So these research papers of Fluid Frame has had the necessary exposure. They have traveled along with me, transcending borders, transcending boundaries, crossing borders, and in their own ways. So I hope you realize that though I live in Kolkata, I live in New Alipur. The first two sections of Fluid Frame, Ruminations on Indian Cinema, and the second section, At the Crossroads of Adaptation. And the section division has been brilliantly explained by Professor Julie Mehta. She was talking about the way I have, divided the sections in my book. So the first section, Ruminations on Indian Cinema, and the second section, At the Crossroads of Adaptation, was not written within the four walls of my study room of New Alipur. It is the outcome of several years of research and conferences attended both in India and abroad. The extremely fruitful academic exchanges I have had over the years with professors, academicians, scholars from all over the world. And this is how Fluid Frame was born. The third section of the Fluid Frame, that is unlocking the troubled mind, aesthetics of Hitchcock and Kubrick, which Ashokta was discussing this evening. They were written after decades of engagement with the works of Alfred Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick. Particularly Kubrick's The Shining was written in 2020. Yeah, this was the last chapter of the Fluid Frame, and this was written in 2020 when India was experiencing a nationwide lockdown. And I have titled this chapter, as you all know, Chaos and Collapse, 40 years into the magnificent enigma of The Shining. The deserted, luxurious hotel, the Overlook Hotel, and the three sole inhabitants of this hotel during off-season, that is Jack, Danny, and Wendy, are completely isolated and separated from the rest of the world. This feeling of separation, this feeling of isolation is something I could readily relate to during those days of lockdown. And it helped me to connect with the film. This was so different from the other horror films I have seen before, like The Omen, Friday the 13th, The Exorcist, Nightmare on Elm Street, Evil Dead, Night of the Living Dead, as early as the 1960s, the black and white film. Even it's so different from that. I Still Know What You Did Last Summer, or say the zombie apocalypse movies, or the Pet Cemetery movies. This particular horror flick, if we can at all call it a horror flick, I don't know how to categorize The Shining. It's just not a horror flick. It's much, much more than that. So this horror flick, The Shining, felt so different in its film language. And it is the late Professor Shubhabrata Bhattacharya who initiated me to the world of Alfred Hitchcock during my undergraduate years, and he inspired me to read Hitchcock's films very closely. And finally, while I was writing draft articles and draft chapters of the Fluid Frame, I received a lot of help and support from my friend Debashish, who is anchoring this event this evening. So thank you, Debashish, for helping me to improve the draft chapters of Fluid Frame. So this is how Fluid Frame was born, and I think in brief, I have recounted the narrative of the birth of Fluid Frame. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pradipta. Pradipta did mention the fact that I was rather privileged. I was rather lucky to go through the drafts of all the essays in the book. I would just borrow a kind of expression out of Pablo Neruda. He was obviously talking about poetry. I will just transfer it to cinema, because what he said was that when you explain poetry, it becomes banal. When you explain cinema, it becomes banal. Better than that is the experience of depicting the feelings that cinema can reveal to a nature open to understanding it. So I'm just, substituting cinema for poetry. That is exactly what Pradipta does. I mean, what I found, the first comment that I had on the draft when she allowed me to read it was that it is so readable. And all of us have actually commented on that. Number one. So, to get to the heart of the matter is not a very difficult thing. And then it kind of takes you along on a journey. We have talked about Pradipta's journey, but what about the journey of the ideas in the book, the traveling of ideas in this book? That actually takes you along. So, the text becomes your best friend, which is something that you possibly cannot say about most critical writing, about most academic writing. So, there is this opaque barrier, it seems almost, between what the author is actually intending to put across to us and the reader who is trying desperately to reach out to it. Here, the text becomes your best friend. Suddenly you're taken by the hand and you are on a journey. You go along a trek. So before you realize, you're into it. So and you're actually already enmeshed in the ideas. You're in it. Sometimes the sheer getting in is a problem. And I also felt that this entire sequence of the book, all of our panelists have gone through it in great detail, of course. But for those who are still yet to read the book, one of the great things and aspects about the book is that, and I think Shondeep and Siddhartho, Julidi have in their own ways talked about it, the layers that lie to a reading of a film. Pradipta herself has said on show today that she reads the film as a text. And of course, her introduction clearly gives the cue from where she picks it up, from the Birmingham School and Stuart Hall, and the treatment of culture as something that is readable, the turning into a text of culture. So I think that explains it to an extent. And the other thing, of course, is that a film is not just a film. I mean, Pradipta has several occasions in the book talked about how a particular shot or a scene is a summation of several factors: the music, the visual angle, the other body language. There are several things that make up the layers that Shondeep talked about, the palimpsest effect that Julidi and Ashokda talked about. So, it's not just one thing. So, if you are just preoccupied with film, quote unquote, it is not a fulfilling experience. But to understand that the art of filmmaking, the art of creating cinema, includes other arts, literature, music, painting, maybe other visual cultures, the figuration. So if you do not have an eye, for example, I came into touch with a film scholar from the northeast of India, who was, of course, Pradipta's contact. She had talked to me very enthusiastically of a film studies course, a workshop that she had done at NIM. And later I came into touch with that film scholar as well. And he told me that, look, the fundamental of cinema is that if you do not have an artist's eye, if you do not see something, it's impossible for you to make a film, do whatever, to paint a picture, to write a poem. You have to have that artistic eye. Even in mundane reality, you have to be able to pick up certain signs and signifiers out of that. If you have that, well, the medium shall take care of itself. If you're interested in cinema, you can learn the techniques later on. But if you do not have that, no amount of training in the technicalities of cinema will make you a great filmmaker. Or teaching in terms of drawing will make you a great painter. So again, that eye, Pradipta, as a critic, Pradipta has that eye. And I'm absolutely thrilled by some of the references to, especially the partition article you make to the ragas being used by Ritwik Ghatak, the use of Rabindra Sangeet by Ritwik Ghatak, in other places, of course. And I would want Pradipta to read some of those sections on the show today. Yes. Hello.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment?
Yes, please.
Because you talked about the technical aspects of filmmaking, right? And before we deviate from this particular point that you mentioned just now, because we have here Ashokda, who is a filmmaker. So, and that day at SRFTI, he was asking me that you have written about vertigo. Pradipta, I would like to talk about the trombone shot. Ashokda, are you here? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hear
Yes,
you.
Ashok. Yes, you being a filmmaker, we have a practicing filmmaker on the panel. So, and of course, the very, respected dean and professor of Satyajit Rai Film and Television Institute. Ashok, that day you were talking about vertigo and the trombone shot in vertigo. I have saved a clip to show to the audience. This evening, would you like to just add a few things about vertigo, which you were telling me very interestingly at SRFTI, and then we can just show that particular clip from vertigo.
Yes, but before that, I'd like to say that there is a very interesting theoretical background to Hitchcockian cinema, and that is that the great realist film critic Siegfried Kracauer, like his French counterpart André Bazin, believed that film was the asymptote of reality, that it was very close to reality, coming almost infinitesimally close, but never really touching it. Any cinema that violated that realistic mold would not really qualify as being cinematic. Now, Hitchcock was one filmmaker that Kracauer identified as being unpredictable. And this was the quality that he was looking for, unlike in Aristotelian tragedy, in which the ending is foretold. So it's not the chronicle of a tragedy foretold, but it's something which happens out of the blue, irrationally, often in a bizarre manner, as in the sudden murder of the character played by Janet Leigh in Psycho, Marion Crane. When Janet Leigh at that point of time was one of the great actresses of American cinema, and one could never imagine that she could be killed off in the first half. Or the even more horrifying murder of the detective Arbogast, played by Martin Balsam later on. So also in Vertigo, the shot that you mentioned has been used to mimic a psychological condition. As you know, in the late 50s and early 60s, cinema had three distinct trends in terms of its psychology. One was what was known as angst, as qualified in the cinema of Ingmar Bergman or Bergman, who believed in the guilt that one had. He needed to exorcise the ghosts of his consciousness, born of his own sexual proclivities, perhaps. The second was what is known as angoscia, the Italian word also for anxiety, as picturized in the cinema of Federico Fellini, films like 8½, and La Dolce Vita. And finally, anxiety in the cinema of Alfred Hitchcock. If you ask me about the thriller as a genre, it is Hitchcock who practically invented it. In Vertigo, the protagonist has this problem. It's somewhat like acrophobia, the fear of heights. Vertigo is a strange giddiness that you feel if you climb up. You feel as if you're about to come down. It's a feeling of being neither here nor there. And to convey this feeling at a very crucial moment when the lady he is in love with, the protagonist, actually falls to her death, apparently. This is shown by a shot which is called the trombone shot, in which he uses what is known as a track shot. That means the camera is on a trolley, but the zoom is used in reverse. So it's either a zoom out and a track in, or a track back and a zoom in which actually the magnification of the frame will remain the same, because the effect of the track in is counteracted by the zoom back. But the zoom flattens the perspective. And so you either see the background receding without there being any change in the magnification of volume, or the background coming very close. A similar effect has been used with a tele-lens by Shyam Benegal in the film Suraj Ka Satwa Ghoda, in the last sequence where Nina Gupta almost impinges on the character of Rajat Kapoor, that Manik Mullah. And in Jaws, when the character played by Robert Shaw, a kind of modern-day Captain Ahab, recounts his great desire to capture this shark, which was what Captain Ahab wanted to do in the case of Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So here, Hitchcock uses a track in and a zoom out to convey the feeling of vertigo, which is essentially a psychological effect. So we could see the sequence.
We will see, Ashokda, I have sent the rooftop chase sequence in Vertigo. Is that okay? Shall we see that?
That particular shot occurs just before the murder. So he will
Mhm.
look down and he will see that, he's reeling from it. I don't know whether that particular shot is there. That's the trombone. It's actually created. A set has been created for that. Anyway, you can show the shot. I've explained it in detail. Show the sequence, even if it is in the periphery. It would give an idea about
We'll show the
the
rooftop chase sequence,
insanity
Ashokda. We
and the magic
have that.
of Hitchcock's mise en scène.
You believe I love you.
Yes.
So,
And if you lose me, then
so
you'll
could you
know
please show the sequence
I
from
loved you and I
Vertigo?
wanted to go on loving you.
I won't lose you.
Let me go into the church. Alone.
Why?
Akash, let's see the Vertigo rooftop chase sequence. Akash.
You believe I love you.
Yes.
And if you lose me, then you'll know I loved you and I wanted to go on loving you.
I won't lose you.
Let me go into the church. Alone.
Why? Madeline. Madeline. Madeline.
I can explain this. You see, there are three shots. They're intercuts of the staircase as seen from a top angle. And in that, he has actually zoomed and tracked. It's actually a tabletop kind of a thing. He's created on the tabletop, but it gives that disorienting effect. He uses it like a motif, a leitmotif, a kind of repetition of a shot. And in the end, you see the staircase once again. This is Vertigo, which was often voted as the best film of all time by, Sight and Sound magazine. And it's a very important film. And Kim Novak plays the role of the lady, and James Stewart. And you'll find actually another character resembling this character coming in the later half. People are always talking about his Psycho, but a more complex psychological thriller is Vertigo.
Okay, thank you, Ashokta. The next sequence that we can watch is from the Psycho, because Ashokta mentioned the Psycho where Norman Bates, after he has murdered Marion, he dumps the body in the car and the sinking of the car in the swamp. We'll see that sequence. So, Akash, can we see the... Yeah, so we had that sequence from Psycho where Norman Bates had murdered Marion and dumped the body in the car, and now he decides to finally get rid of the car. Okay. So, yes,
Devashish, I was just wondering, it would be very nice to have a dialogue with all of us. Is it okay to spend a few minutes if I had a few questions to throw it to Dr. Siddhartha Vishwas and to Professor Shondip Mondol? Would that be all right?
Of course, Julidi. But before that, I actually wanted Pradipta to read one or two sequences from the book.
Sure.
Because you did mention Garam Hawa during your when you presented wonderfully on your journey with the book. You mentioned using certain, and there is this wonderful sequence which I will let Pradipta talk more about in the film, and the sheer art. I talked about the artist's eye and how Pradipta possesses that eye as a critic. I would like to read her that section on Garam Hawa from the first essay of the book, on the partition narrative cinema of Ritik Ghotok and M.S. Satyu. I think this is page 12, Pradipta. If this is any help. If you could just read that.
Devashish, are you asking me to talk about that train sequence where Amina is sitting and the train is moving out of the frame? Yeah, you're talking about that sequence. Okay. I'll just start a bit earlier to give my audience the setting of Garam Hawa, which we all know. We have seen this movie, this partition film. Garam Hawa 1973 is based on an unpublished short story by Ishmat Chuptai, which narrates the plight of the minority community in India. To be more specific, a Muslim family in Agra, a Muslim businessman played by Balraj Sahani, who plays the role of Salim Mirza. Okay, so it's a Muslim family in Agra who decide to stay back in India after partition. And the sequence probably you wanted me to read out is the sequence where after the departure of Qasim, that is Amina's cousin, whom Amina is in love with Qasim. So Qasim is deported to Pakistan. So after the departure of Qasim and his family to Pakistan, Amina alone on the porch is shown knitting for her beloved Qasim. With a pensive look in her eyes, the close-up image of the locked door appears on screen at this point, an effective use of mise-en-scene in the shot. The iconography of the locked door raises a cry in the heart of Amina, who now has to wait for Qasim's arrival, and Qasim never arrives. The camera's movement and pace is handled in the sequence to parallel the movement of a train pulling out of a station. The inexorable sound of a train departing in the soundtrack and its juxtaposition with the final still image of the lonely Amina, almost static with grief in the foreground, is effectively constructed to highlight the fragmentation of a family, the impossibility of an uncomplicated return, the threat of historical separation in the aftermath of partition is localized in the pain of the separation of lovers. That's from Garam Hawa.
I actually wanted you to read this because there is also a magnetic quality to Pradipta's reading, which I think all of us will attest to. And, there is another essay in the book. I don't know if we have the time to dwell on that. It was a very impromptu, a very intense response to the passing of the actor Irfan Khan. Pradipta wrote that essay and read it to me. I remember my first experience of the essay was not in print, but something that she read to me over the phone. And I realized the haunting overtones that she can give to her readings at that point, because she was very emotionally stricken at that point. And it was written again, as I said, a very nascent piece at that point, written very quickly, which was later, of course, edited and found its place in this book. This actually was an obituary, a very impromptu emotional response to the passing of Irfan. So I would ideally want you to read a portion out of that as well, but then there are other things in between. I would now take up Julidi. Julidi had a question or two for, was it Pradipta or was it Siddhartha?
I was hoping we would have a short conversation, but Devashish, for reasons of time, if we don't have the time, that's fine. Would you like Pradipta to read a little bit, and then perhaps Sandeep and Siddhartha and myself can have a very quick wrap up on a couple of questions which they brought up,
Okay.
You decide, you're the chair.
Yeah. So the thing is that there is another, the Mujra sequence, I mean, which Pradipta has written wonderfully about from Devdas, that article that she has written. I also wanted you to read that. And Pradipta, you were telling me there is a clip ready for that particular sequence from the film. So can we have a quick view of that sequence, and maybe then you can read, and then we can go to Julie these questions and we can wrap it up.
Sure. Akash, can you show the Mujra sequence from Devdas where I talk about the female gaze in the song sequence Mar Dala? Okay. So we had that beautiful Kathak sequence from by Madhuri Dixit. She was dancing to the beats of Kathak. So Madhuri Dixit playing Chandramukhi in Devdas. I'll read out that mudra sequence. Chandramukhi has elaborately prepared a mudra, that is a courtesan's performance, for Devdas and eagerly awaits his arrival so the mudra can begin. Now, though trained to be seductive and charming as a courtesan, the image of Chandramukhi that dominates the scene is of a woman destined to lead a lonely and tragic life at the margins of power and seclusion. The mudra sequence in Bansali's film invests in elaborate sets, props, decor, and costume. The villain, Kali Babu, is awaiting a performance by the dancing girl in a hall lit by chandeliers and decorated with candles. Chandramukhi's defiance and spirited manner disrupt any possibility of male viewing pleasure. And as she strikes a deal with the villain to perform as her profession demands and therefore out of compulsion, only if thus does not arrive. Here, Chandramukhi disrupts the male viewing pleasure within the scene, the villain's gaze. As she waits for Devdas's arrival, we as viewers share Chandramukhi's point of view and apprehend that Devdas may fail to arrive within the stipulated time. As the candle is about to be consumed by its own flame and Chandramukhi is on the verge of losing the deal, she reaches out for the ghungru, the sequence you just saw right now, gifted to her by the villain. The sequence also critiques the immorality and exploitative nature of the institution of the courtesan up to this point. As she is about to begin her performance, we see Devdas's hazy image gradually becoming prominent at a distance. A jubilant Chandramukhi begins to perform, but this time out of her love for Devdas. Throughout the sequence, Devdas's presence is entirely passive. He not only refuses to participate in any viewing pleasure from Chandramukhi's performance, but his passivity to the performance reminds one that his presence is out of compulsion. He is there only to return the 2 nights that Chandramukhi had spent nursing him back to life. The only other male character in this scene is the villain of the film, who is now relegated to a marginalized position and is doomed as he fails to connect with Chandramukhi's emotional world. In the scene, the man is not centered. In fact, he occupies a very narrow space on the extreme left. Through her dance rhythm, gestures, postures, and most importantly, her gaze, the villain is marginalized and coerced into taking up the ghungru, a potent signifier of the other woman's threatened humiliation by the male. In accepting the ghungru, he is now made to share the domain of the courtesan, and his humiliation is complete. The last part, the sequence shows how the quote unquote other woman succeeds in disrupting the potential fetishistic gaze. Her rebuking gaze is now directed towards the villain, further helping her oust the male from the space of the kotha. Chandramukhi's position as the iconic Notch girl of Indian cinema who projects female desire is problematized in this scene. Firstly, there is a conscious effort on her part to refuse objectification as a seductress. Secondly, there is a constant oscillation in her role as spectator, gazing at Devdas as an object of devotion, and in the director's simultaneous attempt to make her a spectacle. Thank you.
Thank you, Pradipta. Thank you so much. It actually illustrates a lot of what we have been discussing over the last hour and a half. And now, Julie, you had a couple of questions for the other panelists. Please go ahead.
I don't think I had questions, but I would like to have us give our views. It would be a conversation I'm looking forward to. We'll keep it brief, no problem. But Pradipta is also very welcomed and you are too, Debashish, into the conversation. Now, what I find quite remarkable is the word that I would use, is that throughout the study, Pradipta has broken some very formidable stereotypes. And one of the things that occurs to me is what Professor Siddhartha Biswas just touched upon. You know, he talks about how cross-cultural variety dislodges the idea of the stereotype of what mainstream cinema should do. And I think, to me, that was very important. What does Shundip think? Shundip, did you also find that, Pradipta's argument that mainstream cinema is only important as far as entertainment value goes? And I think her quest was to break this stereotype, especially in the first part of Indian cinema. She does a stupendous job to break that. Jaane Tu Ya Jaane Na, for instance, brilliantly reverses the patriarchy, the masculinity. So what would you say? Would you think that she's managed to show us that Hollywood cinema in the mainstream is not necessarily all entertainment? Has she done that adequately, you think? Siddhartha, Shondip, what would you say? And then we'll turn to Pradipta.
I don't know how to put it. The thing is, in this new millennium, when new curriculum is being built up, one thing we always try to maintain, that we do not allow any demarcating line to come in between the high and the low. So the popular and the elite, this distinction is gradually waning. So our discussions, the programs, the efforts, the academic enterprises that we all put up are all designs to break this hierarchy, to dismantle this hierarchy, that this is low, this is high. So we can even pick up a very common popular song and confer on it the possible erudite dimensions. This is what we have been trying to do since last few decades, last few years. I was talking about how we and Siddhartha, insisted on introducing to our syllabus popular films, popular Bengali film, popular Bollywood films. Tarkovsky, Satyajit, Bergman, they have been always discussions of, grave academia. But, that day is over. That phase is over. We have to bring in the very common, familiar, popular components from the world of masses. So, this is how we would like to go.
If I can add to that, Dr. Beheta, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Yes, I'm looking forward to your impressions as well. I think.
Right.
Yeah.
The project was actually to look at this idea how there are certain establishments which limit certain artifacts within the boundary of the mainstream and promote certain artifacts as highbrow. And there is this inherent politics that is quite obvious. And apart from the commercial angle, even within the commercial angle, there are so many things to read, and the boundary functions as a kind of a distancing method which does not allow us to look at these so-called mainstream popular texts, which which has its own politics. So, and we were helped a lot by the fact that Bob Dylan was given the Nobel Prize at that point of time, and that allowed this discussion to grow. And we have the Beatles in our syllabus. We have a lot of popular music, although we have not been able to do justice to them because of the pandemic and everything. But they allow us to, kind of approach the whole thing from a very cultural, political perspective. And, Pradipta's book would be a lot of help in this for us. So that would be my observation here. Dr. Mehta, I'm sure we would like to listen to some of your observations here as well.
Well, I think it's absolutely wonderful, because before I turn to Pradipta to wrap it up and have the last word, I would like to say that, I've been teaching for the last 5 years, I've been teaching your master's course at Loreto College, because I came back for my mother and she passed away with dementia in 2019. And with what has happened now, it's an impossibility to go back to Canada right now. But anyway, it's absolutely glorious, because সেই বান্ধাত্তা আমলের যে সিলেবাস আমরা পড়েছি, and I'm a Loreto alma mater, তারপরে যাদবপুরে MA করেছি, I would lay down the purple carpet for you both. I mean, what you have done in changing the syllabus, it's, as I tell my scholars who are here, the MA students are here today listening to all of you, I always say that you don't know how lucky you are, because you are studying a syllabi which could be part of a global syllabus. CU, JU, dutotei lectures diyechi, but hats off to you guys, amazing. And I think this layering, this whole idea of palimpsest, it has changed our view of literature. Krishnadi was also my professor, so you can trace the entire the academic norm from then to now, and it's brilliant what's happening. So
I must just say something here. It was not only the two of us, but the entire department was absolutely amazing. Professor Chinmoy Guho, all our seniors in the department, the support was fantastic. We all felt that there has to be a change now. It's high time that we look at certain things, and we, with due respect to the classics, it's not like we're discarding them, but we are trying to create a kind of a flow which brings our students to modernity. So
and they are
that
so
was the
excited,
idea.
I must tell you, they are so excited. Whoever I speak to amongst the students over the last 5 years, they feel it's a good place to be at CU. So with Pradipta's people such as Pradipta, the younger scholars who are introducing this whole idea of new sights and new sounds. Pradipta, how would you conceptualize in briefly and tell us how this idea came to you, that that it's not much doubted that mainstream cinema, I think Shondeep put it very well, that there are no paradigmatic geographies here. The lines are blurred, and that's what is encouraged, which is great. But in your book, what I find amazing is how you talk about the idea of mainstream cinema not merely is a form of entertainment, but it is also a form of instruction, or a form of opening up areas which we never spoke about earlier. For instance, lesbianism, for instance, the LGBTQ issues. You would be surprised as to how grateful students are in UG and in PG. Pradipta?
Thank you, Julie. That's a very interesting question you raised in today's discussion. What we have been trying to discuss for so long, what Shondeep, Siddhartha, and you, and even Ashokda was talking about, Debashish was also very much involved in the discussion. This book, Fluid Frame in Cinema, has tried to, transcend those compartments, those boundaries between high culture and low culture, what is considered as high brow and what is considered as low brow. what is exactly a mainstream commercial cinema and what is, I would say, a kind of new wave art cinema. Now, of course, a new wave, nouvelle vague, art cinema, parallel cinema has a style of its own. You know, it's a much more, I would say, a much more serious study of society, of human characters. The style of the director is very different because it just does not have a kind of commercial outlook. But even a kind of art cinema or parallel cinema may be considered as a commercial cinema, because each and every film that is made, irrespective of the fact whether it is art film or a commercial film or a mainstream genre film, each film has in mind the commerce angle. No film is made without the commerce angle in mind. So all films, even art films, are commercial films. So this is exactly what the fluid frame has tried to do. It has tried to cut across those rigid boundaries between high art, low art, what is considered as high culture, low culture. And this is what exactly my previous book, Shakespeare on the Celluloid, has also done. It is not only discussed major author directors like Laurence Olivier, Akira Kurosawa, or Franco Zeffirelli, or just say Orson Welles, Peter Brook, not just those very, revered directors who are making highbrow Shakespeare. But my book, Shakespeare on the Celluloid, also discusses popular Shakespeare films. Right? By popular Shakespeare films, I have studied Shakespeare in Love. Okay, I have studied Julie Taymor's Titus. I have studied 10 Things I Hate About You. So even Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet, where you have Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes playing Romeo and Juliet. So
There is
those
another
were
Hamlet, Michael Almerida's Hamlet, but played by Ethan Hawke. Yes.
Michael Almerida's Hamlet has a chapter devoted to it in Shakespeare on the Celluloid. There's one full chapter on Michael Almerida's Hamlet. So yes, I was not only discussing author directors, Kenneth Branagh, or say Franco Zeffirelli, or Peter Brook, or Akira Kurosawa, or Kozintsev, because Ashok was talking a lot about Kozintsev, but I was also discussing popular Shakespeare films. So that was another book which was trying to, cut across those divides between what is considered as highbrow, effeminate, institutionalized Shakespeare. So that book was trying to, deliberately dismantle the concept of institutional Shakespeare. Similarly, Fluid Frame, it was a daring task. Initially, I was a bit apprehensive of the fact that if I start my book with Ritik Ghatak and I talk about films like Meghe Dhaka Tara, Subarno Rekha, and then I move on to MS Satyu's Garam Hawa, which is so very, these are such serious films, and watching Meghe Dhaka Tara, I am sure Siddhartha and Debashish will agree with me that watching Meghe Dhaka Tara, Subarno Rekha, or watching Garam Hawa, even after so many years of partition, Garam Hawa hurts. It hurts badly. So it's not just a partition film, it's a tragic love story, the love story of Amina and Kasim. And after that, when she realizes that Kasim will never come back to her, she falls in love with Shamshad. And then Shamshad also leaves for Pakistan, and then she commits suicide. So these are stories which are very profound, the profound experience of human experience of partition.
Pradipta, Garam Hawa is on the syllabus in many North American universities, and teaching Garam Hawa as part of the partition literature that we teach in post-colonial studies is big time. The students, some of them come from with no experience of reading partition literature of India, so it really hits them, and Garam Hawa is it's an iconic film. I hate to use that word, but that is a word,
So, as you see, Julie, discussing Garam Hawa and Meghe Dhaka Tara, Ritik Ghatak in the first chapter, and then gradually moving on to the so-called Hindi cinema, Mumbai cinema. I wouldn't call it Bollywood because that's a very contested term, and let's not get into the arguments of whether I have used the term Bollywood in my film. I won't get into that contested domain. But Hindi cinema, yes, it is we can go for a serious study of Hindi cinema, and that is what I have done. I've tried to do with the films of like fashion. I have talked about Zindagi Na Milegi Dobara. I have talked about Jane Tu Ya Jane Na, and even a very popular kind of film like Dil Dhadakne Do. So these are even I've talked about all this in my women directors chapter, and also media representations of women's sexuality. And then I have moved again to the adaptation section, where I have talked about Victorian texts like Wuthering Heights. I've talked about this American, The Great Gatsby. Then I have moved on to Shakespeare film adaptations, and the last section is obviously again on Kubrick and Hitchcock. So this is exactly what the Fluid Frame has tried to do, to transcend those so-called boundaries between high culture and low culture, and to erase those boundaries altogether. Any cinema, once it is made, it becomes if the cinema is well made, if the cinema is a good one, if the movie is a good one, it we can read it closely, and we can actually get into a serious academic discussion on that movie, irrespective of the fact whether it's a commercial film, or it's a popular film, or it's an art film, or a new wave cinema, whatever. So that is what exactly Fluid Frame has honestly tried to do. Thank you, Julidi.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pradipta, Julidi, Siddhartha, Shruti, Ashokta, who is not here right now, but Ashokta as well, and of course Professor Chinmay. It has been a wonderful evening's discussion. All that was missing was a virtual cup of coffee, which of course we promise each other to actually have sometime, pandemic permitting, of course. Before I end, I must thank Cambridge scholars for believing in a scholar like Pradipta, publishing her book, for SRFTI, Ashokda, the Dean of SRFTI, for supporting this event, and Inspirare Arts Foundation for taking such great interest in such an exchange between art forms, literature and cinema. Before I end, I will just end with a couple of lines out of Stanley Kubrick, a little quote out of Kubrick, where he said that a film is or should be more like music than like fiction. It should be a progression of moods and feelings. The theme, what's behind the emotion, the meaning, all that comes later. We will give you ample time to digest what we have been talking about, Pradipta's book. And I'm sure, as all our panelists agree, that her book shall be a beacon to all scholars of film and lovers of film, lovers of the moving image, and will obviously be a productive presence by them in times to come. So our very best wishes and felicitations to Pradipta Mukherjee and to the Fluid Frame in cinema, and our expectations that we look forward to more from you. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. Congratulations, Pradipta and Devashish.
Thank you so much. Good to meet you all.
Sandeep and Siddhartha.
It was a pleasure.